Boldwood presents Bad Girls, written by Gemma Rogers and read by Imogen Church. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. I stared at my trembling hands, the flesh glowing a radioactive pink. Blood seemed to have worked its way beneath my cuticles and was proving difficult to remove. I'd scrubbed them with bleach, eyes streaming, skin on fire. But still I scraped the brush back and forth, watching rosy specks line the sink. Karla forced me to stop, resting a cool hand on my arm, her fingertips glacial. She was calm, thinking clearly, whereas my head was spinning like a carousel. What had I done? "We have to take care of him, Jess," Karla said, as I dried my hands on a paper towel, wiped the sink clean and flushed it down the toilet. She handed me some latex gloves, retrieved from the large store cupboard, and nodded in the direction of the warehouse where the industrial machines were housed. The unit where Bright's laundry service was based was relatively new, a 12,000 square foot warehouse in an L shape on a small industrial estate on the edge of Croydon. Our closest neighbour was an automotive parts supplier who kept to themselves. The rest of the units were mostly offices, with a parcel distribution company taking the largest warehouse at the entrance to the estate. The space was open plan, with the exception of Terry's office, the toilets and a store cupboard full of detergent and various supplies. It felt like a shell, a cold, damp space, until all the machines were working, and then it became stifling. It had never felt as claustrophobic before now. Eyes wide, I glared at Karla. "We have to call the police," I said. "And go back to prison?" she hissed. Her words were enough. I followed her back to the office, where he lay, sprawled, half in, half out of the door. I glanced towards the window, blinds open a crack to see the sky darkening to a threatening red. There was a chill evident in the air, not unusual for early February. The lights were on a timer. They came on at 4 and went off at 7 unless turned back on. "Help me," Karla gasped as she rolled him over. His face was purple. Blood had begun to pool beneath the skin where he'd been lying on his front. She stood, hands upon bony hips, sweat beading on her brow. Her dark glare piercing as she wiped her cheek with her forearm. Wild corkscrew curls pointing in every direction. "We've got to get him out the back." I could see she was getting frustrated with me, and I chewed my lip, willing myself to think clearly. We were both small, around 5 feet. Years of undernourishment had left my limbs wiry. Was hers for the same reason? The body at our feet had to weigh in excess of 13 stone. Dead weight. "We need tape," I said, eyeing the office chair. If we could get him in the chair, taped in so he wouldn't fall, we could wheel him out between us. Karla left the office, and I wrinkled my nose. It smelt sickly sweet inside. The smell of death lingered in the air, not helped by him shitting himself as he passed. Bile rose and my chest heaved, but I swallowed it down. The mobile rang out again, still discarded on the floor where it must have fallen from his pocket. It was the second time it had gone off. Kim, in large capital letters, flashed on the screen. Must be his wife, wondering where he was. I glanced at the clock. It was 5:30. No doubt she was expecting him home from work, perhaps wanting him to pick up a pint of milk on the way. What would we do with the phone? I needed time to think. If we got anything wrong, I'd be going back to prison, and Karla too, just for helping me. Got it. Karla made me jump as she came back in, a roll of silver duct tape on her wrist. She wrapped tape around the ankles of each trouser leg. He's definitely shit himself, don't know about you, but I don't want any of it spilling out when we move him. I shook my head, my thumb and forefinger rubbing my earlobe, trying to concentrate on not being sick. After 10 minutes of struggling, we managed to get him into the chair. His body flopped forwards and I recoiled as I made contact with damp skin. Drool leaked from his mouth, dripping onto his chest. I turned away so I wouldn't gag. We wrapped tape around his middle, securing him to the back of the chair and his ankles to the base so his legs wouldn't drag. What are we going to do with him? I asked. There's only one thing we can do with him. It's too risky to take him anywhere else. We have to burn him here. I shut my eyes for a second, trying to stop my head swimming, until Karla tugged on my arm, bringing me back to the present. There was no time to waste. We had to get on with it. It wasn't the easiest method of transportation, but between us we managed to push and pull him out to the large red medical waste incinerator. The warehouse contained the industrial machines, the washers, dryers and presses, as well as the incinerator, which was reserved for sheets that couldn't be cleaned. Brights would receive a load from a local private hospital Terry had a contract with, and some would be stained with blood or faecal matter. These would have to be incinerated, and almost daily sheets were loaded into the bin tipper at the side to ensure minimal contact. Using the controls, the bin was raised, sliding the sheets directly into the chamber at the top for incineration. Unwrapping Terry from the chair, the smell of faeces made me gag. Together, we wrestled him from the chair into the tipping bin, but his dead weight was a struggle. His body, as well as being heavy, was becoming stiffer by the minute as rigor mortis set in. At one point, I was waiting for Karla to suggest removing his legs as we struggled to fold them in. It would have been the final straw. I'd have given in and called the police, no matter what he'd done. I couldn't hack him to pieces, dead or not. Our muscles screaming, we finally sank onto the floor, a joint puddle of sweat and grime. The effort involved in getting him inside the tipping bin had been immense, and we were exhausted. Come on, we've got to keep going. Karla sighed, heaving herself up. She squinted, trying to remember the controls of the incinerator, saying she'd only used it a couple of times because Terry liked to operate it, as it was the most expensive piece of kit he owned, and he didn't trust anyone else with it. Our speciality was the enormous washing machines that could wash in the region of 30 kilograms of sheets at once. As she tried to work out which button ignited the cycle, I hurried to the office, ignoring Karla's calls at my retreating back. I had to pull up the carpet tiles. They were old and cheap, a dark blue colour. Most were coming unstuck and beginning to peel back from the concrete. Only 2 had bloodstains on that I could see, and they needed to go into the incinerator as well. They came away easily with a good tug. The floor beneath looked to be clean, I surveyed the office, but nothing else looked out of place. The desk was a mess as usual, covered in paperwork with 3 coffee-stained mugs on top and a half-full bottle of Gaviscon next to the monitor. "Good thinking," Karla said as I returned with the tiles, throwing them in the tipping bin with Terry. She helped me out of my tabard before removing her own and tossed them inside. She hovered at the controls, chewing the inside of her cheek as she deliberated. "Do you know what you're doing?" I asked. "Fuck no," she said, slamming her fist on the big green button. The machine sprang to life, metal screeching as it lifted the bin and opened the chamber. Terry toppled down inside, landing with a thud. The tipping bin lowered, the chamber locking, and it fell silent for a second. Karla and I looked at one another, but before I had a chance to speak, there was a hiss, a spitting sound, and a whoosh of flames from inside. The deed was done. Chapter 1. 1 month earlier. I met Karla on my first day at Bright's laundry service. My case manager, Barry, at the Community Rehabilitation Company had managed to put a good word in for me. I was relieved there was no prolonged job search involving multiple rejections. The following week of my release, I'd secured the position as laundry operator with an immediate start. Based on the outskirts of Croydon, it was only a short bus ride away for me, so the location was good. Barry knew the owner, Terry Bright, well, apparently, and I was hired at a little over minimum wage to load and unload the enormous washing machines. My day was spent wheeling around huge trolleys of sheets, getting them washed and moving them to another section to be dried, folded and repacked. It wouldn't have been a job I'd have chosen, but I was grateful to be employed at all. I knew my prospects weren't great, my criminal record unappealing to prospective employers. I took a few days to adjust. It was a much more demanding job than my last one as library assistant at HMP Bronzefield. Bright, Terry told me proudly during my induction, had contracts with a number of private hospitals and hotels in South London. Brights were climbing the ranks. Terry was trying to get into the more prestigious hotel chains, but to me, it was just a laundry, washing dirty linen. At the end of each day, my muscles ached from the physical work I wasn't used to. After a week, my clothes were looser, and I rarely consumed enough calories to cover what I was burning. Inside was like a sauna, and some of the girls who'd been there longest said it often hit 100 degrees on warmer days. The air was stifling, sweat dripped off us, and it was easy to get dehydrated. We had to carry water bottles everywhere. The heat was one thing, but the noise took a while to get used to as well. Lots of industrial machines all whirring at once. Sometimes you had to shout to be heard, but I was used to that from Bronzefield. Lots of girls worked at Bright's, although not many were talkative, and most, like me, preferred to keep themselves to themselves. I got the impression I wasn't the only one on bail conditions. Everyone had the same look in their eye, all of us just a little bit broken. Stuck in a dead-end job with no prospects, there was a general sense of hopelessness that clung to our skin. No one appeared to be much older than 25. We were petite, slim girls, like the Stepford wives of the laundry world. The conditions weren't great, but beggars couldn't be choosers. Karla and I met properly when we were thrust together to deal with a large load on my second day, which had to be turned around quickly. The machines were out the back, lining the sides and in motion almost constantly. In the centre were long tables laid out for sorting and folding. "Fag?" Karla asked, as we finished loading 2 machines side by side and got them going. She rolled her narrow shoulders, collarbones jutting up through her t-shirt. We had a few minutes before the next load was finished, and I was desperate to get out of the stuffy environment. All the air had been sucked out of the atmosphere and into the machines. Sporting yellow underarm stains on our t-shirts became the norm. I nodded and followed Karla out of the rear of the warehouse, underneath the shutters where a couple of cars were parked. The fresh air hit like a burst of oxygen to a deep-sea diver, and immediately I was lightheaded from the temperature dropping so quickly. I took a sharp intake of breath, blowing out foggy air. "You don't talk much," she said, seemingly unfazed by the chill and pulling a packet of Mayfairs out of her pocket to offer me one. I took it and she lit it for me. "I'm Jess," I said, fingering the empty piercing on my earlobe. I already knew her name was Karla. I'd heard another girl call after her. We looked about the same age, early 20s, although I was rubbish at guessing. I knew I didn't look 22, more like 17 at a push. "How'd you end up here?" she asked, taking a long drag of her cigarette and flicking the ash into the air. Her chin stuck out, exaggerating her pointed features, and she carried an air of confidence I wasn't used to here. I gravitated towards her straight away, like a weaker animal in the pack does towards a stronger one. 4 years in Bronzefield, I said, knowing Karla was almost certainly an ex-offender and would know the female prison. "Send," she replied. "I'd heard of HMP Send. Apparently you were lucky if you got sent there." I nodded and kicked at the gravel with my trainer, spreading the sea of cigarette butts. We didn't speak much that day, quietly getting on with our work. We stopped for another couple of cigarette breaks, and I promised to bring in some tobacco the next day to repay her. At the end of my first week, when our shift finished at 5, we walked out of Bright's together and stood awkwardly on the pavement. Karla suggested we went for a cup of tea at a nearby cafe, sitting outside so we could smoke and not be overheard. She asked me where I was living, and I explained I had a bedsit a couple of miles away. Stuart, a graphic designer at the offices where my sister Helen was a receptionist, had converted his garage into a large bedsit with a kitchenette, toilet and shower. The garage door had been removed and the space bricked up around a newly installed window and a UPVC door. Stuart had put underlay and carpet down, plastered and wallpapered the walls and boarded the ceiling, but it was still a bit cold and occasionally damp. Although it felt like a palace compared to my cell at Bronzefield. The extractor fan in the tiny bathroom wasn't the best, but I was thrilled to finally be showering alone after 4 years. I got the impression it had been a cheap renovation done mostly by Stuart, with the exception of the electrics and plumbing. I was happy to have my own space, something bigger than the cell I'd shared. Helen had made it pretty clear on my release that I wasn't welcome back with her and Mum. However, she didn't want me living on the streets. I suspect Mum would have pushed her to arrange something for me. Stuart was friendly enough and knew my history. Plus, he was only charging £80 a week, including bills, probably because the place wasn't legally habitable. We finished our drinks quickly, and I bought us refills, wanting to delay going back to the bedsit. I'd been living in one room for long enough, and I loved being outside, even if it was freezing. Karla was sofa surfing, she said, until she could get a deposit together for her own place. I didn't even own a sofa. Well, I did, but it was also my bed. I hoped she wasn't tapping me up for lodgings. There was barely enough space for me. Perhaps she couldn't afford to rent anywhere. Money was an automatic problem when you were released. Lack of funds meant no roof over your head and relying on friends and family. Difficult if they didn't want to know you anymore now you were a convicted criminal. You could earn money inside, working, but most of it was spent on tobacco or biscuits. Anything to make your sentence more palatable. You had your first meeting with Barry yet? Karla asked. I shook my head and used my last chunk of tobacco to roll 2 cigarettes, passing one to her. Not since he got me the job, I replied. Barry was the community rehabilitation officer assigned to me on release who had put my name forward for Brights. He saw his probationers every week. Karla said she reported to him too, once a week, but only for another 2 months, then she was free. I would be seeing him for the next 6. Barry was witty, sharp as a tack, and impossible not to like. He was in his mid-30s, average height, with kind eyes, freckles and auburn hair that would curl if allowed to grow. On our first introduction, shortly after I was released, he talked easily about Catholicism when I mentioned I went to an all-girls school. I'd remained quiet as his voice boomed around the tiny room. He was a fountain of information on life on the outside and rehabilitation. Not beaten down by the system like so many others who dealt with us daily, trying to keep us on the straight and narrow. At times it must have felt like a thankless task. When he first saw me, he declared I needed feeding up and handed me a lukewarm sausage roll from Greg's. Although rude of him to comment on my stature, I'd munched away, my stomach rumbling gratefully. Pastry crumbs had rained on the table as I watched him complete some forms on my behalf. Together, we wrote a rehabilitation plan, how I would go about integrating and adjusting back into society. When we were done, he took a long look at me, sizing me up, and said he knew somewhere that might take me on. Can't wait to get the fuck out of here, Karla sighed, wrapping her hands around her mug, her nails bitten to the quick. You mean Brights? I asked. Karla nodded and took a long drag, squinting as the smoke reached her eyes. Her fingers stained yellow from nicotine. Brights, Croydon, all of it. Once I'm off licence, I'm going to move down the coast, Brighton, or somewhere. What about your family? Don't have any now, Karla said, gazing far into the distance. Everyone has parents. I haven't been home since I got released. It's better that way. She said it so abruptly, I assumed they'd turned their backs on her. It obviously wasn't something she wanted to talk about. I surveyed her without detection. She was pretty, caramel skin and eyes so dark they could be black, but the circles beneath and hollow cheeks aged her. I couldn't talk. I knew I was a far cry from the girl who had been sent down. My skin no longer glowed, now sallow, and hair like straw. I avoided mirrors. I hated my body, the jutting collar and hip bones. Gone were the soft curves and femininity. I was too angular. Karla and I were the same, pointy and hard. She grimaced. A shadow crossed her face. I was dying to ask what she'd been in for, but it wasn't the done thing. Most ex-offenders were private and didn't want to talk about their time inside or what had led them to it. I suspected whatever it wasn't as serious as mine. Although small and fierce, Karla didn't look like she'd killed anybody. Chapter 2. Terry Bright's office was a mess. Every surface covered in leftover polystyrene food cartons from the fat wagon, the van which came around the industrial estate to feed all the hungry workers. His bin was overflowing with discarded crisp packets and chocolate bar wrappers, but that didn't stop him shoveling the cold fried egg sandwich into his mouth, licking his fingers one by one. I was amazed to see he had a wedding band on, unable to believe he'd got someone to marry him. My stomach rolled, throat constricting as I stood in front of the desk waiting for Terry to speak. He was a short, greasy man with sallow skin and a receding hairline. Although he always appeared to wear fresh clothes, his face had a sheen, like a permanent layer of sweat resided there, and come the afternoon, the smell of body odour lingered in his office. Finally, he spoke, mid-mouthful, his accent reminiscent of an EastEnders character. It sounded exaggerated, as though it was what he thought a South Londoner would sound like. "How did you find your first week, Jess?" Dabbing his mouth with a serviette, missing a splodge of yolk on his cheek entirely. "Good, thank you," I said politely. Terry thought he was a big deal. Owner of Bright's, master and commander of all in his shitty warehouse. I'd heard him holler at some of the others. He talked to them like dirt, but he paid our wages, so I guessed he believed he was entitled. He gestured for me to sit and I lowered myself into the chair. "I like to look after my girls. Extra hours, bonus schemes, you know." His eyes twinkled. "You interested in any of that? Going the extra mile?" He rubbed his crotch provocatively, and I chewed the inside of my cheek, my gaze falling upon the expanse of skin where Terry's overhanging belly had stretched his shirt buttons. An icy finger traced its way down my back. He scrutinised me, lingering on my non-existent chest. I stayed quiet, shrinking inside, contracting smaller and smaller, trying to shrivel away. Terry stood and walked over to the blinds, twisting the handle to close them, concealing his office from the warehouse. He stood so close, towering over me, I could smell sweat emanating from his shirt. I sat rigid, biding my time before I intended to open the door and flee, but he returned to his seat behind the desk. On the wall, I eyed the clock. It was 5:10 on Monday afternoon, my second week at Bright's. Most of the workers would have left already. Terry had called me in just as I was taking off my tabard. "Now, Barry and I are good friends. He likes to keep in touch and see if you're all behaving yourselves," Terry said, pushing back from the desk, wheeling himself into view, legs spread wide. I swallowed. "You are, behaving yourself, aren't you, Jess? I can tell Barry you're settling in just fine." I nodded. Terry licked his lips, slowly unbuckling his belt, lowering the zipper and sliding his hand inside. I balked. "Your wife?" I said, my voice low, knowing I was clutching at straws. "What she doesn't know won't hurt her, eh?" He simpered, tapping the framed photo on his desk I hadn't noticed before, and gave me a wink. A blonde woman holding a gummy toddler smiled out at me, and I thought I might be sick. My head swam as I watched him play with himself for a moment, unable to tear my eyes away from the nauseating sight.
"I think we have an understanding, right?"
He chuckled, eyes glinting. My heart pounded in my chest. Heat bubbled inside, whooshing upwards like a bottle of fizzy pop. "Go fuck yourself, Terry," I spat and pulled open the door, grabbing my rucksack from the side and rushing out of the building. I didn't look back. At the bedsit, I took a long shower, but I couldn't scrub myself clean. It wasn't the first time I'd been propositioned. Favours were traded for sex on the inside daily with the prison officers, but when I walked out of those gates, I thought I'd be able to put that behind me. Did I go back to Bright's tomorrow, pretend like it never happened? I needed the job, the money. Employment didn't come easily to ex-offenders, and I had to keep a roof over my head. I wouldn't survive on the streets. Agitated and unable to settle, I walked that evening for hours, my stomach tied in knots. Drizzle lit up by the street lamps as I moved between them, the pavement slippery underfoot. It was cold and miserable. Not the sort of night to go for a walk, but the bedsit was small and the walls closed in until I felt I was in my cell again. I rang Helen's mobile, but she didn't answer. I wasn't surprised. Things between us were strained, to say the least. I didn't ring the home phone. I didn't want to disturb Mum, not if she didn't want to speak to me either. Helen had met me outside Bronzefield Prison on my release day with a suitcase full of clothes, an old mobile phone and a bag of groceries. She held the key to Stuart's garage conversion, and once she'd driven me there and I was settled in, she'd left. Unbeknownst to me, it had all been arranged while I was inside. Apparently, I wasn't welcome to live back at Mum's, and she'd organised the bedsit to keep me away. I was surprised she was still living there now she was 25. She'd always said she'd move out the first chance she got. Perhaps she'd stuck around to help Mum out or keep her company. I put the phone back in my pocket. I didn't have anyone else to call. Helen's was the only number I had in my pay-as-you-go phone. My best friend when I was a teenager, Ashley Parsons, had gone to Portsmouth University. I hadn't spoken to her for 4 years. She wrote a couple of times while I was inside, apologising for what happened, but I asked her to stop contacting me. Not because I was angry about that night, but I wanted her to move on, forget the past. She had a chance at a real future, and I wasn't going to let this mess drag her down. She'd always been the smartest of us, the one who was going to get off the St Helier estate and make something of herself. I never thought it was that bad, although everyone said it was overrun by hooligans, kids on mopeds, dealing drugs on every corner. It was never quiet. Loud music boomed into the night, and no matter what time of day there would be someone rowing and a baby screaming. The more respectable, hard-working adults moaned about antisocial behaviour and vandalism, but nothing ever changed. Looking back now, I can see we were perceived as the hooligans, although we were only ever having a laugh. The estate was our playground, and Mum worried because I was always there. Ashley lived near the estate like I did, her parents always saving to move away, but she loved being in the thick of it all. I too was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I just didn't realise then that I would get burnt. By the time I returned to the bedsit, my clothes were damp from the January drizzle, and I hung them over the chair to dry, although I knew they wouldn't. The atmosphere was dank, a musty smell in the air. I snuggled down in my cold duvet and read The Faraway Tree by Enid Blyton. It had been one of my favourites as a kid, and Helen had packed it for me. 22 years of life shoved into a tiny red suitcase, the kind advertised as perfect for hand luggage when you were nipping abroad for the weekend and didn't want to check a bag. I'd never even been on a plane. I went back to work the following day. After all, what choice did I have? Nothing was said, and the next 3 days were uneventful. I kept my head down. Terry didn't call on me. In fact, I only saw him once, and when I did, he awarded me a wink, which made my knees turn to jelly. Karla was sullen and not particularly talkative, so when we were teamed together again, we worked quietly, loading and unloading, going through the sheets to see what we could clean and what had to be incinerated. I didn't mind. I liked not talking. What did I have to talk about anyway? I worked, I went home, I read. Sometimes I found solace in the library in their last opening hour of the day when my landlord, Stuart, had his family round. If he could, he'd pre-warn me they were coming, as the noise would be unbearable. His young nephews were little tearaways who loved to scream the place down, and it would echo around the bedsit. We spoke most days, arriving home at similar times. He loved a chat and would find a way to slot Helen into the conversation. So much so, I was sure he had a bit of a crush on her. Dinner consisted of pot noodles and pasta sachets that just required hot water. The only appliance I had was a kettle and a small fridge, although Stuart had promised me a microwave at some point. Most of my money went on the laundrette. I didn't have enough clothes to wear for the week, and once worn for a day at Bright's, there was no way you could wear them again before washing. At the weekend, I promised myself a trip to the charity shop to see what I could scavenge. On Friday afternoon, Barry, our rehabilitation officer, came in for a visit. He came around to each of his probationers, 6 in total, seeing us in action before individual meetings. His role was to help us transition back into mainstream life, smoothing any bumps along the way. I got the impression he thought he was saving us from ourselves, where we'd be destined for a life of crime. Karla went in to see him just before I did. She came out, nostrils flared and fists clenched, storming past me out of the warehouse.
"Got a minute, Jess?"
Barry called as my head whipped around. He'd seconded Terry's office for the afternoon. I sat down on the chair, warmth Karla had left behind seeping into my jeans.
"Watch out for her. She's a wild one, that girl. Hard to keep on the straight and narrow. Some toe the line better than others, but I admire her spirit. I might actually miss her."
He chuckled to himself, rubbing the ginger stubble protruding from his chin.
"So,"
he said, flipping open a beige folder with my name on it, containing the forms we completed and my rehabilitation plan from the last time we met. He fingered the pages, scanning my information. I clasped my hands in my lap. Something about Barry's demeanour made me nervous. It was too formal compared to our time together before.
"Tells told me some money has gone missing from his office."
My jaw slackened. "I haven't taken anything." I laid my palms flat on the desk, already feeling the flutters of panic.
"Well, there's no proof anyone has taken anything currently. However, when it disappeared, there were only a few of you left in the building. I just wanted to reiterate that any illegal activity could result in you serving the rest of your sentence banged up. You'd be whipped back inside quicker than you can blink."
I ignored my impending tears, refusing to cry. I couldn't go back to prison. Barry's face softened and he reached over to pat my hand.
Just do whatever Tell asks of you, yeah? And you'll be all right.
I stiffened, pulling my hand away, glaring at Barry as the penny dropped. I'd been such an idiot. It had been too easy coming out of prison, being assigned a lovely caseworker, one who had found me a job quickly. Everything was going too well. What happens if I quit? I asked, keeping my voice even. The alternative was too hideous to contemplate.
Well, you can, of course, but it'll be difficult to find employment with your kind of record. I don't have that many places up my sleeve I can refer you to. It's okay here, though, isn't it? Tell treats you all right, doesn't he?
Barry frowned, his eyes warm and compassionate. Had I got it wrong, or was Barry not the person I thought he was? Yes, I stuttered, mainly because I didn't know what else to say.
OK, just have a think about what I said. Keep your head down. Well done for your timekeeping and hard work.
I left the meeting and went back to my machine, mind whirling and a sour taste in my mouth. Chapter 3. Karla was wrenching the wet sheets out of the washing machine, swearing under her breath and grunting with exertion. Throwing the sheets into her trolley with such force it rocked on its wheels. I caught it just before it tipped over. "What's up?" I asked. "He's such a bastard," she spat. I stared at the ground. Perhaps I hadn't been wrong after all. What had Barry said to upset Karla so much? "Got us all by the short and curlies here, no fucking where to turn." She sighed and rested her palms flat on the folding table, head bowed low. I had no idea what to say. How could I console her? I reached across the table and placed my hand on top of hers, mine ice white compared to her darker skin. Her head snapped up, watery eyes screaming with silent contempt. "You'll be out of here soon. You said so yourself," I muttered, taken aback. She looked vicious, like a rabid dog. I slowly withdrew my hand. "Not soon enough." She stalked off, pulling her cigarettes from her pocket as she went. I didn't follow. A few minutes later, Barry left, giving me a wink on the way out. My insides squirmed like eels in a bowl. For the rest of the day, I helped Agnieszka, a Polish lady with delicate features and the smallest feet I'd ever seen. She told me to call her Agnes, and we worked together to remove some hotel bedding from the pressing machines to fold and repackage. She talked continuously about her mother coming over to England for the weekend and how she was going to cook pierogi, traditional Polish dumplings. I guessed she was around late 20s, dark hair and eyes, and she looked like she'd blow over if she got caught up in a gale. I got the feeling she wasn't one of us. Most of Terry's girls were ex-offenders, Barry had told me, but not all. I zoned out of the constant chatter in the end, thankful when 5 o'clock came around. It poured with rain as I left, and I jumped on the bus home, looking forward to the weekend ahead. 2 whole days stretched out in front of me where I could do what I pleased. I'd rung Helen again to see if she was free to meet, It went to voicemail and I'd left a message, but she hadn't come back to me. Was she freezing me out too? Just like Mum? I tried not to dwell, not to let it ruin my mood. I'd intended to get a Subway on the way home for dinner, but the weather was so awful, I settled for a pot noodle and a Kit Kat. Where was Karla now? She was the closest thing I'd made to a friend on the outside, if you could call her that. She would likely disagree. Tomorrow morning, I planned to head to the library and see if I could get some more books and maybe use the computer to find some faces from the past. My phone was so old it had no apps, no social media for me to search. I'd have to remedy that once I'd saved enough wages. A smartphone was a necessity nowadays. When I snuggled into bed, the rain hammering against the window, I was still unsettled about Barry and Terry. What were they up to? Why had Karla lost it? I hoped I hadn't made a mistake joining Bright's. I knew I could be too trusting, but it wasn't like I had many options. There were a few places that took ex-offenders. Timpson Shoe Repairs was one, but there was no way I was going to be working with people's manky shoes all day. It was bad enough working with soiled sheets, but I had a thing about feet. I tossed and turned all night, dreaming I was back in my cell in Bronzefield. Darcy was threatening to set my hair alight if I didn't give her the chocolate digestives I'd bought. She wanted to swap them for a hit of spice, a drug some of the girls smoked. Drones would regularly be flown over the wall with packets that looked like cannabis to me. They'd be mixed with their usual tobacco, but you could smell it straight away. Occasionally, letters would get through the post soaked in spice, and tiny strips would be sold at extortionate prices for smoking. Everyone was looking for some kind of escape from prison life, but I was always too scared to try. The ones I'd seen on it looked like zombies, completely out of it. If Darcy had her way, she'd be zoned out all the time, so she was always looking for her next hit. I'd negotiated her down to half the pack of biscuits and offered to pick up some books for her from the prison library. She'd agreed, but I'd still curled up on my bunk, too terrified to go to sleep. When I finally did, I dreamt my hair was crackling. The scent of burnt flesh forced me awake. I'd woke in a puddle of sweat, my hair still intact, and Darcy snoring above me. Nightmares were part and parcel of life on the outside, a constant reminder I was never truly free. Not when I had to report into Barry in answer to the community rehabilitation company. My life wasn't my own. It could be snatched away at any time, and we were never allowed to forget it. Karla was right. They did have us by the short and curlies. Mentally, it was almost as much of a prison on the outside, terrified to put a foot wrong in case I was sent back to Bronzefield. Early the next day, I had a change of heart about my plans. I ran through the shower and put on the nicest clothes I owned, nothing fancy, a pair of boyfriend jeans, some scuffed biker boots and a midriff-skimming long-sleeved polo neck. All circa 2016. I had no idea what fashion was like in 2020, having not been around to find out. I didn't waste what little money I had on magazines, and I had no television in my bedsit either. The outside world passed me by. Whether it was fashionable or not, it would have to do, although I had to wrench in the belt and the top was baggier than it used to be. Thankfully, the rain had stopped overnight, and I jumped on the 151 bus outside the train station, which took me up to Rose Hill near St Helier Hospital. My mum and sister lived in a terrace house in Thornton Road, the house I'd grown up in, although, much to Mum's disgust, I was always over on the St Helier estate, knocking around with the wild kids, as she used to call them. I know she was trying to shelter us, but we were no better off than them, living in a council house, scrimping month to month. My paper round money and most of Helen's wages at Topshop from her Saturday job all went on keeping the lights on. My mother was a resilient woman who fiercely protected us growing up. She'd be down the school to sort out the bullies, pulling them to one side and whispering in their ears, ensuring I was left alone. After Dad died of a brain tumour when we were still in primary school, she became two parents in one. The soft, loving mother, always ready with a cuddle, but she was also a lioness, shielding her cubs whenever we were threatened. I don't really remember Dad, but I never felt as though I missed out. Mum was enough. All my friends thought she was stuck up, thinking she was better than the families on the estate, but now I see she was just trying to keep me safe, trying to steer me in the right direction, away from the crowd I was hanging out with. I wrote to her every week when I was in prison, but she only replied once. I knew as soon as the verdict was announced, the moment I was pronounced guilty, my relationship with my family was broken. Helen visited a couple of times in the beginning, but slowly withdrew as time passed. The visits stopped and the phone calls diminished. I was left to serve my 4-year sentence alone. With lead in my feet, I approached the also-familiar pebble-dashed house. The orange streak from the leaking overflow pipe to the left of the door had widened since I'd last been there. The front garden was a mess. Crisp packets and bottles had been stuck into the hedge by passers-by. Red paint flaked from the wooden door and the house looked tired. My hands trembled by my sides. I was a different person the last time I stood in front of the door. I was happy, loved, and had my mother's comfort back then. Memories of her stroking my hair and putting plasters on my grazed knees as a child flashed into my mind. It seemed light years ago. I bit my lip and, steeling myself, tapped on the door. The wait was excruciating. At first, I thought no one was home, but a shadow appeared behind the glass, a flash of blonde hair. It must be Helen. I formed my mouth into a smile, the exact opposite of hers, when the door swung open. "What are you doing here?" Helen hissed through her teeth and stole a glance over her shoulder. I had expected our reunion to be awkward. Strained, maybe, but I hadn't expected such hostility. "I came to see you and Mum," I said, frowning. Wasn't that obvious? Helen tutted and, after a second debating with herself, pulled open the door. A musty smell hit me straight away, as though no fresh air had been allowed in for months. A faint aroma of urine followed, hitting the back of my throat. Helen turned and whisked into the kitchen. I followed, hoping she'd put the kettle on, but instead she turned to face me, leaning back against the counter and folding her arms. "You can't be here. Mum is sick, and she'll get upset if she sees you." "What do you mean? Sick?" The panic was rising in my voice. Helen shushed me, her eyes narrowed. "Mum had a stroke 2 years ago. Occasionally she gets confused, has accidents, gets upset. I'm trying to take care of her, but if she sees you,
she'll lose it."
My stomach sank to the floor. Why hadn't Helen told me? I looked around the crisp white kitchen. In stark contrast to the outside, inside was spotless. Everything was tidy, the worktops clear of clutter, the scent of bleach in the air. "Where is she?" I said, turning to leave the kitchen, but Helen grabbed my arm, digging her fingers in.
"She's sleeping. And even if she wasn't, she doesn't want to see you."
I brushed her off.
"Look, is this what you came for?"
Helen grabbed her purse off the side and pulled out a £20 note, thrusting it in my direction.
"Oh, fuck off, Helen!" I spat, storming into the hallway and yanking open the front door. "What did you expect?" She rushed after me as I crossed the threshold onto the garden path.
"I just wanted to see you and Mum."
"You fucking killed someone, Jess. It ruined all our lives,"
Helen said, as though she was guilty by association. "Who is it? Hell?" I heard a frail voice call out before the front door was shut in my face. Chapter 4. Blinking back tears, I stared at the red paint, the flaky door that stood between me and Mum, contemplating beating on it with my fists until Helen opened it. She was lying. Mum was awake and I wanted to see her, even if it was only for her to tell me never to return. I couldn't believe she'd had a stroke. Was it all my fault? Had I caused it? A culmination of the pain and stress. I wanted to face her, let her tell me she didn't want to see me. I banged on the door, refusing to leave it like this. I kept pounding until my fist was sore. Eventually, Helen opened it and pushed me down the small step, forcing herself out of the house and shutting the door behind her.
"It's 9:30 in the fucking morning, Jess," she hissed, her fingers wrapped tightly around a bunch of keys.
"I want to see Mum."
"Not now. She's just woken up."
"I've been calling, Helen. I want to see her. I want to see you. You're the only family I have. You're all I've got." She sighed, seemingly unmoved by my plight. I clenched my teeth tightly together. We'd never been close, but the animosity came off her in waves.
"It's not all about you. She's not well. I don't want to cause her any stress, and you hammering on the door isn't helping."
"Well, let me help. I want to help."
"I think you've done enough."
Her words cut like a knife. "Doesn't she want to see me?" I asked, not quite believing the mother I knew would abandon me.
"I'll talk to her, okay? I'll be in touch."
Helen turned and let herself back into the house, swiftly closing the door. There was little point fighting when she was in this mood. She was like a dog with a bone, a pit bull guarding the gate. Helen was my older sister by 3 years. Always had a sharp little nose in the air, far more superior than the rest of us. Although she couldn't hide her bitterness, because even though I was the tearaway, the one who'd buggered up her exams, played truant at school, the no-hoper, I was Mum's favourite. Helen had always been jealous. I knew it was because I reminded her of Dad, whom she missed terribly. Helen and I looked similar, long blonde hair and deep-set greenish-grey eyes, but our personalities couldn't have been more different. Cut from the same cloth, yet she was silk, and I was polyester. We'd never really seen eye to eye. She seemed to think we were always in competition. My molars crunched together, grinding as I walked past the bus stop and down the road. Inwardly, I raged, feeling stupid for not asking more questions. Was Mum bedbound? Could she walk? Helen had no right to keep me away. I'd have to come back when she was working. I still had a key, unless they'd changed the locks. I had a vague memory of them being handed back to me in a clear plastic bag as I left HMP Bronzefield, along with everything else taken away the night I was arrested. I hadn't thought to dig them out before I left. Now I wished I had. Hearing my mother sound so frail made my heart ache. Had I done this to her? Had my crime torn the family to pieces, as Helen said? I never meant for it to happen. It was an accident. I hadn't meant to hurt anyone. My sister was right, though. Someone had died. I sniffed, fumbling for a tissue in the pocket of my bomber jacket, and hurried back towards home, making a detour to the high street where I knew there were 3 charity shops in close proximity. My anger had subsided by the time I perused the racks. Oxfam didn't have anything other than old lady clothes, but cancer research was a treasure trove. I spent just over £10, but walked away with 2 French Connection t-shirts, 2 pairs of Next jeans, and a jumper. They all had that charity shop smell I'd have to wash out, but in the meantime, a bit of body spray would do the trick. I found a fluffy hot water bottle too by the counter for £1 that I bought without hesitation. I couldn't help but glance at the row of books for sale before I left, having to return to the till again. 50p bought me a teenage fiction book, and I practically squealed when I found The Enchanted Wood, the first book in the Magic Faraway Tree series, for another 25.
"Don't I know you?"
came a voice to my right as I sat on the bench outside, trying to roll a cigarette, the tobacco pouch balanced precariously in my lap. I lifted my head, licked the paper to seal the roll as I did. A pock-marked man's face loomed down at me, pale skin with breath which stank of lager, even though it wasn't even lunchtime yet. "No," I said flatly, although he looked familiar. He sat down next to me, buffing up until our thighs touched. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, a cap covering greasy hair and a hoodie pulled up over the top for extra warmth. I shuddered. Damn it, I knew I should have remembered to look for a new coat.
"I'm sure I know you, darling. You look familiar. You used to live up by the hospital, didn't you? St. Helier, right?"
I looked at him more closely, wrinkling my nose at the proximity, throat suddenly dry. His name was Gilby, one of the lads from the estate who we used to knock around with. The years had been less kind to him than they had to me, and that was saying something.
"Roll us up one, would you, love?"
He nudged my shoulder. "I've got to go," I said, jumping up and hurrying across the road.
"Jess, that's it, isn't it? I remember your pretty face. You killed my mate Eddie,"
he shouted, pulling himself to his feet. He followed up by hollering, "Fucking bitch!" But I didn't look back. Shaken, I darted into one side street and then another up towards the library, thinking I could get the 127 or 151 bus home. Perhaps it had been stupid to come home. I hadn't changed my appearance, and Eddie used to run in some nasty circles. In the 4 years that had gone by, I hoped the past might have been forgotten. Maybe a lot of the old crowd would have left the area as we all morphed from teenagers to fully fledged adults. I was wrong. Should I be afraid? Would anyone come looking for me once word got around that I was out? As the cold seeped in, I wrapped my arms around myself and hurried on, legs aching as it dawned on me I'd walked over 4 miles since I left the bedsit. Warmth from the library escaped from the automatic doors as they opened, and I stepped inside, allowing myself to be enveloped. I had just over an hour before they closed for the day. Shrugging off my coat as I heard my mother's voice ringing in my ears about not feeling the benefit, I headed straight for the computers. I tried to log on to my old Yahoo email account I hadn't touched for 4 years, but my username was no longer recognised. Perhaps I couldn't remember it. I spent a couple of minutes creating a new one, trying to think of a suitable password I'd remember. Glancing around, waiting for a word to pop into my head, the 3 computers to my right were taken by students. All were plugged into their phones, wearing oversized headphones and writing on large A4 notepads. Could Ashley have sat there over the past 4 years, working on her degree? No, she would have stayed near campus, studied from there. Like me, she couldn't wait to get out of here, and the chance to move away would have felt like a golden ticket. When the accident happened, we were both doing our A-levels at sixth form, although Ashley was a year ahead of me. She got her results while I was on trial and immediately applied for a degree in science at Portsmouth University, a 5-year course with an optional work placement. It wasn't an option to carry on my A-levels inside. I could have picked up my course again on my release, but I needed money for a roof over my head. Education was a luxury I couldn't afford. I finally selected a password and moved on to open a Facebook account under the name Emma Evans. Emma was the name I always wished I'd been given, what I called my dolls when I was small. It seemed so much nicer than Jessica, and Evans was the last name of the actor who played Captain America, the hottest guy on the planet as far as I was concerned. I immediately searched for Ashley Parsons and she popped up, the 6th in the list. Her profile picture was her in a tight-fitting dress, dark waves cascading over her shoulders, smiling at the camera with a glass of bubbly in her hand. I sighed, eyes prickling from seeing my best friend's face again, one I hadn't seen in a long time. She looked happy, older and polished, a far cry from us in our jeans and hoodies back then. I wiped the moisture from my lashes. Perhaps one day our paths would cross. She could tell me all about university and how her life had changed. I couldn't help but be envious. Our lives had gone in opposite directions. I flicked through her photos, grateful her account didn't seem to have any privacy settings. Clicking through, every single picture showed Ashley smiling, and I burned when I saw her arm slung around another girl, the same one in many of her photos. She was my replacement. Ashley had moved on whilst I was still stuck in 2016. I kept scrolling as far back as I could to see if there were any photos of me, but my breath caught in my throat. The pointer rested upon a photo of him. A large pink heart framed a black and white close-up shot of his face with the words, "Taken too soon," underneath. The photo had over 400 likes and loads of RIP comments. His steely eyes seemed to lock onto mine, and I squeezed them shut, swallowing hard, forcing the lump in my throat down and the guilt along with it. Voices from that night echoing around my head. The noise, the sound of knuckles against flesh and screams were as fresh as the memory. I opened my eyes, clicking on the photo to enlarge it, and forced myself to take it in. The image on the screen was of Eddie Watts, Ashley's boyfriend back in 2016. The one I'd gone to prison for. The one I'd killed. Chapter 5. After a minute, I clicked back and Eddie's face disappeared. Once he'd gone, I was able to breathe again. I hadn't seen his face for such a long time, not since his picture was printed in the newspapers before my sentencing. Painted as the innocent victim, a shot of him with his mum gazing at the camera through his dark eyelashes. I was painted the villain of the piece, although I knew better, and so did Ashley. It didn't stop me from feeling remorse, though. Taking a human life was something I'd never get over or stop trying to make amends for. When I first arrived at Bronzefield, spending hours in my cell with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company, the guilt had driven me mad. I wrote to Eddie's family, pouring my heart out in pages of attrition for what I'd done, but I never received a response. I was sure it was because I'd pled not guilty at the trial, swept up in the advice from my solicitor, who turned out to be severely lacking. It was another reason my sentence was quite harsh for a first offence. During the first year, I cried myself to sleep, even praying at times, hoping my repentance would bring me back from the edge. The listening service helped a lot. Prisoners trained in counselling would be available to talk to, and I was there once a week. Getting the job at the prison library brought me back. It kept me busy, but the guilt never went away. My fingers lingered over the keys, and I typed in various names of people I hung around with then. Andy, Ben, Nicola, Joe. Some I found, some I didn't. I didn't friend request anyone or like any posts or photos. No one would have any idea who Emma Evans was, and I didn't want to draw attention to the fact I was back in town. As earlier proved, not everyone would be pleased to see me. Helen had a profile on Facebook, but hers was set to private, so I could only see her main photo. It was recent, last summer maybe, in a pub beer garden, wearing sunglasses with a bottle of Corona in her hand. Just as I was about to log off, I had an idea and typed Karla's name into the search box. Hundreds of Karlas came up. I don't think I'd ever heard her surname mentioned. Sighing, I closed the internet down, aware my stomach was rumbling loudly. Lunchtime had arrived and I hadn't eaten yet today. I couldn't hang around the library, although I was tempted for the warmth. There was no point, it closed soon, and I couldn't get a new library card as I had no way to prove my address. No bills in my name. I was anonymous. A nobody. I popped into the baker's for a sausage roll and ate it outside whilst I waited for the bus to take me home. My eyes darted around the busy high street, sizing up the faces passing by to see if there was anyone I knew, or who might recognise me, but there wasn't. I stayed in the alcove of the boarded-up sportswear shop to keep out of sight until the double-decker bus rumbled into view. The bus dropped me practically outside my new home, and I let myself in, annoyed I'd forgotten to buy tea bags. At least it gave me something to do tomorrow. Visiting Mum would have to wait until I knew Helen wouldn't be there.
Jess!
A knock at the door followed Stuart's voice. He must have heard me come back. I sighed and turned off the almost boiling kettle. "Hey," I said, swinging open the door. I could see Stuart look over my shoulder, and I opened the door wider so he could see I hadn't wrecked the place. I didn't mind. It was his rental, and he'd let me stay, not knowing me from Adam, with only the word of my sister to vouch for me.
"Hi, you all right?"
He shoved his hand in his pockets, and I tried not to smile. He was reserved, and I was sure he felt awkward around me, the convicted offender. "Yeah, fine. You?" I asked.
"Yes, thanks. Just wanted to let you know in case I don't catch you tomorrow, I'm away Monday and Tuesday, so if you can keep an eye on the house, I'd appreciate it. You've got my number if you need it."
I nodded. I had it written down somewhere, although I hadn't put it in my phone yet. "Sure, no worries," I said, and we exchanged smiles.
"Oh, and this is for you."
He stepped to the side, back up to his front door, and returned with a small silver microwave. "Thanks, Stuart, that's amazing." I grinned, rolling onto the balls of my feet, excited at no longer having to eat pasta pots. I backed up, letting him pass, and he carried it into my room.